Hey guys, tonight we start with the amazing strength and, let's say, the creative ways the Viking people handled being uncomfortable. They somehow survived the cold Scandinavian winters without any central heating. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always interesting to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background sound, or a space heater if you're feeling a bit cheeky about history. And let's start tonight's journey together. When the temperature outside dropped to absolutely naught, the Vikings didn't panic. They simply went inside their longhouses. These were large, low buildings, and only a little easier to breathe in than a modern sauna built inside a barn. These longhouses were the Vikings' version of winter shelters. They were mostly built with timber if you lived near trees, or with blocks of earth and stone if you didn't. They were built low to the ground to save heat and wide enough to fit many families. In some cases, they also had a few cleverly placed cows, because nothing says cozy like sleeping next to something that chews its food all day and breathes out steam. The key to surviving the cold was sharing warmth. Think of a longhouse as one big, shared battery for heat. Human bodies, animal bodies, and a fire pit, all working together in a cozy but stuffy harmony. It was less of a house and more of a survival cuddle shelter. The fireplace ran through the center of the longhouse, acting as both a stove and a heater. There were no chimneys, because chimneys hadn't been invented yet. Or, more accurately, they had been, but not in places where people were still using bones to hold doors open. Instead, smoke rose and gathered in the roof beams. It sometimes found its way out through a hole in the roof, or it just stayed right where it was. This turned the entire ceiling black and everyone's lungs into ashtrays lined with wool. To us, today, Viking homes might seem incredibly smoky, crowded, and strangely personal, and that's because they were. But for the Vikings, it was the best choice, unless they wanted to become a snow statue. Raised sleeping platforms lined the walls, often filled with straw, moss, or anything soft that could catch fire. Families, and sometimes their goats, all slept in the same space. Not because they loved each other that much, but because warmth was necessary and privacy hadn't been invented yet. In short, Viking longhouses weren't comfortable, but they worked well. They kept people alive during harsh winters, even if they didn't keep them smelling fresh or well-rested. Viking fashion was less about looking good and more about not freezing to death before breakfast. If there was one thing the Norse people understood better than raiding, it was layering, and not just with a scarf and mittens. We're talking full-body wool armor, made stronger with fur, leather, and a total lack of shame. The base layer was linen, if you were lucky enough to have some. Linen was light, let air pass through, and was good at soaking up sweat. Unfortunately, it also tore easily and was expensive to make, which is why most people went straight to wool. Lots of wool. Viking men wore tunics over trousers with leg wraps, which were basically old-school thermal leggings. Women wore long woolen dresses layered with aprons and cloaks. Everyone wore belts to hold things together and pouches to carry whatever they needed. Knives, a flint for fire, or maybe a piece of emergency cheese. Cloaks were essential. They were fastened with brooches, sometimes lined with fur, and if you didn't have one, you probably didn't have much time left. Boots were made of animal skin, often from cattle or seals, and were made waterproof with a lot of fat. Viking shoes weren't pretty, but they were sealed with grease and kept the wind out. The only downside was that you smelled like a beef jerky factory. For the really serious survivors, animal intestines were sometimes used to make waterproof layers. Yes, actual animal guts. They were cleaned, scraped, dried, and sewn into a kind of early raincoat. It wasn't breathable, but it did keep out snow and rain. And no one was going to make fun of your outfit when you were literally wrapped in internal organs. Hats, mittens, and scarves were all common, often made from felted wool. This was wool that was beaten until it lost its shape and became a warm, thick mat. If you didn't own gloves, you stuffed your hands in your cloak and hoped no one noticed your fingers turning blue. When it came to surviving icy Scandinavian nights, the Vikings had one rule for food: eat like your life depends on it, because it actually did. Calories weren't a treat, they were insulation. Viking winter food wasn't fancy, but it was heavy, fatty, and very practical. Let's start with the basics: meat, dairy, grains, and preserved fish. Lots and lots of preserved fish. They smoked it, salted it, dried it, and fermented it, and they didn't apologize to anyone. Lutefisk, for example, is white fish soaked in a chemical called lye until it's half food and half a dare. Not delicious, but it was amazing at not going bad. For bigger meals, stews were the main choice. Vikings threw whatever they had into a pot over the fire. Pieces of meat, root vegetables, oats, even sour milk. The longer it cooked, the better. The result wasn't pretty, but it filled you up and probably stuck to the bowl. Dairy was eaten all year round, but it was especially important in winter. Cheese and butter were made during the warmer months and stored for the cold season. And not the nice, creamy kind. Think hard, salty, wheel-shaped blocks of milk solids made for survival. Perfect for chewing, trading, or throwing at wolves. They also made skyr, which was sort of a yogurt and sort of a cheese. It was definitely the Viking version of you'll eat it and be happy. High in protein and incredibly sour. It was like a slap to the face. It woke you up, but it was confusing. Grains were stored in large amounts. Barley and rye were used to make flatbreads and porridge. Viking bread was heavy, dark, and sometimes baked with crushed tree bark to make the flour last longer. Again, not tasty, but if it kept your blood sugar from freezing, it was doing its job. And finally, alcohol. Ale and mead weren't just for parties. They had calories, were slightly clean, and were very comforting when your toes had gone numb. Mead especially made you forget that you lived in a smoke-filled shed with farm animals and 6 relatives. And if it tasted terrible, even better. No one would steal your leftovers. When winter hit hard, and in Scandinavia it always did, Vikings turned to their most reliable source of heat: other mammals. Bringing animals inside wasn't considered weird. It was considered smart. Chickens, pigs, sheep, goats, and even cattle were invited into Viking longhouses, not for company, but for body warmth. Think of it as old-school central heating, powered by mooing. The animals were usually kept in a section of the longhouse called the byre, which was basically the garage mid-stable part of the house. A low wall kept animals and humans somewhat separate. And by somewhat separate, we mean close enough to smell, but not close enough to pet without getting into trouble. On very cold nights, the lines blurred. A family might cuddle closer to the animal section. Children might take a nap next to a sheep if the ox was warm and didn't mind. Congratulations, that was your pillow now. Not cozy, but it definitely worked. The logic was simple. Animals create heat. A cow can produce as much warmth as a small campfire and doesn't need firewood. In extreme cold, that warmth could be the difference between waking up with frostbite and waking up only a little annoyed by the snoring pig. Of course, the side effects were less pleasant. You had to deal with the noise, the smell, and the occasional hoof in the wrong place. And yet, Vikings didn't complain. They understood a simple truth. Warmth now, dignity later. It wasn't just about heat, either. Keeping animals close protected them from being stolen, from predators, and from freezing to death outside. Farm animals were a family's wealth, food supply, and heating system all in one hairy hay-heating package. In many cases, longhouses were designed with this in mind. Builders intentionally directed warmth from the animal section toward the living area. It was architecture based on survival instinct, simple, effective, and very, very smelly. Vikings didn't just survive the cold, they handled it with a surprisingly cheerful attitude. When the fire was low, the goats were grumpy, and the smoke turned your longhouse into a barbecue pit. You still had one last defense against the cold: each other. Huddling together wasn't just for warmth, it was a way of building community. Families slept side by side on raised platforms, covered in wool, and whatever pieces of animal hide weren't being used to patch the roof. Privacy was a myth. Comfort was a rumor, but warmth that was shared. Children snuggled between adults. The elderly were treated like warm treasures. Dogs and cats weren't pets. They were heating devices with whiskers. Everyone packed in, breathing each other's smoky, cabbage-smelling air, and pretending they couldn't hear Uncle Bjorn snoring like a wounded moose. But this wasn't just about physical survival. Winter isolation could mess with your mind faster than the cold could freeze your toes. That's where Viking humor came in. It was rough, direct, and strangely effective. They told stories and sang songs, often about warriors freezing to death bravely, which somehow made everyone feel better. They made fun of each other with sharp jokes and no filter. Nothing fought off winter sadness quite like teasing your cousin for falling in the outhouse last week. Feasting was another key way to boost spirits. In the middle of winter, food that had been saved since fall was brought out in large amounts. This wasn't just to celebrate the festival of Yule, but to remind everyone, hey, we're still alive. And look, we have turnips. Vikings also held games and competitions inside. These sometimes included riddles, board games, like an early version of chess, with more backstabbing, or wrestling matches that occasionally knocked over the farm animals. The goal wasn't just to have fun. It was to distract from the cold, the dark, and the very real chance that spring might never come. But most of all, they survived winter because they expected it to be hard. There was no complaining, no feeling that they deserved to be comfortable. Misery was the normal setting. Anything better was a bonus. Insulation, as we know it today, uses fiberglass, foam, or other high-tech materials with catchy brand names and warning labels. The Vikings had no such luxuries. Their plan for insulation was simple. Stuff as much of nature into your walls as you can and hope it works. A Viking longhouse wasn't drafty by mistake. It was kind of by design. These homes were built to hold heat, using whatever materials were around. Timber if you lived near forests, or blocks of earth and stone if you didn't. The walls were thick, sometimes up to a meter, and the idea was to trap heat in any way possible. Between the logs or stones, they packed moss, straw, mud, or animal hair. Anything stringy, thick, and smelling vaguely warm was stuffed into the cracks. It wasn't fancy, and you probably didn't want to lean against the walls with bare feet, but it worked. Roofs were often made of thatch, or even better, layered, with sod, which is literally grass and dirt. This wasn't some trendy, eco-friendly design. Turf roofs were excellent for insulation, pretty good at keeping water out, and sometimes, if the conditions were right, They would grow weeds or mushrooms, indoor gardening, an accidental salad bar, maybe. The floor was usually just packed dirt, sometimes layered with straw or reeds that were changed out every so often. And by every so often, we mean whenever the smell could no longer be explained away as rustic. Windows were rare and small, if they existed at all. Light came from the fire or from well-placed smoke holes. Why no big windows? Because glass was expensive, drafts were deadly. And Vikings didn't care much about natural light when it was pitch black outside for 3 months anyway. And yet, this messy collection of timber, dirt, and biological fluff was surprisingly effective. It turned a longhouse into a slow cooker of shared body heat and goat breath, perfectly able to handle the Scandinavian winter. It wasn't a spa, it wasn't breathable. It probably wouldn't pass any modern building codes. But it kept Viking families alive, warmish, and just smoky enough to preserve their food and confuse insects. When the fire burned low and the wind howled outside like an angry ice monster, Vikings used a proven method to survive the night: sleep. Like your life depends on it, because it did. Viking sleeping arrangements were less about private bedrooms and more about a strategy to create a warm mass. Whole families, sometimes including distant relatives and any sick farm animals, slept on raised wooden platforms that lined the longhouse walls. These beds were covered with straw, moss, or hay, and layered with fur, wool, and a sense of acceptance. There were no sheets, no duvets, no fancy pillowcases. If it was soft and didn't bite, it went on the bed. Everyone slept in their clothes. Changing into pajamas in freezing temperatures was a good way to become a Viking popsicle, so layers stayed on. Boots were sometimes even worn to bed. If that sounds crazy, remember that frostbite doesn't care about your dignity. Babies were wrapped up tightly and held close. Children were often placed between their parents or older siblings, not for emotional bonding, but for simple, practical insulation. It was basically a family-sized meatloaf of humans and wool. Couples slept together, of course, but so did anyone who could fit. Being modest was not a priority. Warmth was. If someone's feet wandered a bit, that was called survival, not a scandal. Wool cloaks were draped over bodies like old-school thermal blankets. Animal hides, especially from reindeer or bears, added another layer of warmth. If you had a bearskin blanket, you were either very rich, very lucky, or very dedicated to hunting scary things in winter. In richer households, or during very harsh winters, heated stones or bricks were sometimes placed under the bedding. Yes, the Vikings had their own version of a hot water bottle, only heavier and more likely to burn your thigh. And if the fire in the hearth went out during the night, you didn't relight it right away. You pulled someone closer and muttered something. In Old Norse, that probably meant, "Don't you dare steal the fur again." In short, sleeping in a Viking longhouse wasn't glamorous. It was smoky, cramped, and had a 100% chance of snoring. But it worked. In theory, smoke was supposed to float up and escape through the thatched roof or a vent near the top of the house. In practice, it clung to the roof beams like an unwanted guest and slowly settled down into everyone's lungs. You didn't breathe fresh air in a Viking house. You breathed experienced air. By the end of a winter evening, your chest felt like it had smoked a pork shoulder, and so did the pork shoulder. Strangely enough, this wasn't all bad. The smoke helped preserve meats and fish that were hung from the beams. It also kept insects and mold away. Plus, the constant low-level exposure probably gave every Viking the breathing system of a Victorian coal miner. Still, the downsides were hard to ignore. Red eyes, hacking coughs, and ceilings stained darker than the god Odin's mood. Small children and the elderly likely suffered the most, being shorter and therefore closer to the thickest layers of smoke. You know, because physics is a jerk. Some families tried to deal with this by building raised platforms or sleeping closer to the ground to avoid the worst of the smoke. Others simply pushed through with watery eyes as they stirred stew or tried to find their bed without tripping over a half-cooked goat. A few Viking homes, the fancy kind, had actual smoke vents in the roof. But for the average Norse family, smoke was just part of the atmosphere. It warmed you, seasoned your food, and reminded you every single day that fire was both a friend and a flaming health risk. And if things got too smoky, you opened a door, let in the fresh air, and froze your toes off when the darkest days of the year arrived. And the sun decided to take a month off. The Vikings turned to an ancient and very effective survival tool: celebration. You can't freeze to death if you're too busy drinking and yelling around a bonfire. This was Yule, the midwinter festival that was part religious event, part survival plan, and part excuse to eat everything that wasn't tied down. It usually began around the winter solstice and lasted for days, sometimes even weeks, depending on how much mead they had. This wasn't just a party, it was a psychological lifesaver. Yule lifted spirits when everyone was feeling down from the cold. It gave people something to look forward to besides not dying. Families gathered. Animals were sacrificed, for blessings and for dinner. And great fires were lit to symbolize the return of the sun. These weren't small, romantic flames. These were huge bonfires that practically dared the night to come closer. They feasted on preserved meat, drank ale and mead, told stories, played games, and sometimes, just sometimes, they sang, and not politely, either. Viking singing probably sounded like someone trying to charm a thunderstorm with a battle cry. The Yule log, which is now a cute dessert or decoration, was originally a real log that burned for days. It was meant to represent warmth, continuity, and not letting your family freeze. Practical and symbolic, very Viking, that there were also supernatural worries. Winter was seen as a time when spirits, trolls, and restless ancestors roamed freely. So, rituals, charms, and offerings were made to keep the peace, and maybe to convince those spirits not to steal your goat. And yes, a lot of modern Christmas traditions were borrowed from Yule: evergreens, feasting, gift-giving, and dragging. Dead trees indoors were all Norse approved. But above all, Yule was about surviving together. In a world with no light switches, no vitamin D pills, and no concept of seasonal depression, the Vikings created joy from scratch, with fire, food, and a strong belief that the cold would pass, because it always did. And when it didn't, well, at least you went out with a full belly and a story worth telling. In Viking Age Scandinavia, gold was nice, and silver was better, but wool was life. Wool wasn't just a material, it was a Viking's main weapon against the cold, second only to fire and the occasional cuddle with a sheep. It was spun, woven, stitched, and layered into everything: cloaks, tunics, socks, mittens, underclothes, and blankets. If it could be made from wool, it was. The reason was simple: wool works. Unlike cotton, which clings to you like a cold, wet betrayal, wool keeps you warm, even when it's damp. This is useful when your local weather forecast is freezing fog with a side of regret. Every household, especially on rural farms, raised sheep, not for their cuteness or cheese, but for the glorious, itchy miracle growing on their backs. Spinning wool was a job for the whole year, usually done by women and children. In winter, it was the closest thing to warming up the future. The Vikings didn't do fashion just for looks, but their woolen clothes were surprisingly well made. Tunics were fitted. Cloaks were cut to allow for easy movement. Leg wraps were expertly tied to avoid tripping over yourself in the middle of a blizzard. The design followed the need, and warmth followed the design. In fact, the quality of your wool said a lot about you. Coarse wool meant you were poor or practical. Soft, tightly woven wool, that was luxury. It was the Viking version of a cashmere hoodie. Wealthy Vikings could afford dyed wool, sometimes even imported colors like blue or red. Everyone else wore 37 shades of sheep. And don't forget felt, which was wool that had been soaked, stomped, and beaten until it fused into a windproof mat. Vikings used felt for hats, boots, mittens, and sometimes to insulate walls. It was like making fabric from anger and foot sweat. But it worked. Wool clothes were patched, repaired, and passed down. Nothing was wasted. Even wool scraps were rewoven into socks or used as stuffing. A good cloak could last for generations, as long as it didn't catch fire, blow away, or get buried with you as part of your funeral outfit. It may sound strange, but some of the coldest weather people in history were also big fans of getting even colder on purpose. Yes, the Vikings had a thing for saunas and ice baths, because why just survive the cold when you can challenge it to a fight? Viking sweat lodges, called bad stofa, were small huts or pits built with stone and earth, where hot stones were doused with water to create steam. You'd sit inside, half naked, and sweat like a warrior at a summer party, while the outside world froze solid. It was a hot, humid, smoky break from the ice-covered reality outside the door. Then, and here's the real fun, some Vikings would run straight outside and jump into icy water or roll in the snow. They did this on purpose, for health reasons, or more likely, because they were trying to prove to themselves, the gods, and anyone watching, that they feared absolutely nothing, not even freezing to death. These hot-cold rituals weren't just for showing off. They were practical. Sweating helped clean the body, or at least it made you feel like you were doing something about the fact you hadn't bathed properly in weeks. The extreme temperature changes also improved blood flow, cleared your sinuses, and made you temporarily forget you lived in a world without insulation or painkillers. They also had a social purpose. Saunas were shared, meaning families or groups sweated and froze together. Sometimes this was part of a ritual, and sometimes it was just to bond while slowly steaming their regrets away. And of course, steam rooms also served as birthing rooms, healing spaces, and temporary hospitals. If something needed fixing, heating, or flushing out, the Viking answer was almost always, let's cook it first, then freeze it for good measure. These traditions were so effective, they stuck around. In fact, modern Nordic countries still love sauna culture, though these days, they tend to leave the goats out of it. Surviving the cold was one thing. Surviving the boredom, that was its own kind of battle, with long dark nights, frozen ground, and months of not being able to raid, sail, or plant anything. Vikings had to get creative about passing the time indoors without losing their minds or killing their relatives. First up, repairs and prep work. Winter was the perfect time for sharpening weapons, fixing tools, restringing bows, and mending clothes. If your shirt had a hole in October, you'd better believe it was patched by candlelight in December. Unless you enjoyed frostbite in creative new places. Then there was spinning and weaving. Women, children, and anyone with two working hands spent endless hours turning wool into yarn and yarn into clothes. It wasn't glamorous, but you knew your cloak didn't make itself. Every stitch was another layer between you and death by wind chill. Crafting also became important. Wood carving, bone, tools, antler combs. Winter was when practical skills turned artistic. The longhouse might look gloomy from the outside, but inside it was a busy hub of quiet work and occasional swearing when someone dropped a needle. Storytelling was the big one. The Vikings didn't have Netflix, but they did have sagas, epic, spoken tales of gods, heroes, monsters, and other family members who made poor life choices. These stories were passed down by firelight. Each retelling was slightly exaggerated for dramatic effect. Thor didn't just kill the giant. He probably punched the moon afterward. Games helped, too. Vikings played board games like Hinafada, strategy game that makes chess look like tic-tac-toe, and dice games that involved luck, bluffing, and possibly a little gambling. Some families also played riddles or held fake fights when things got really dull. Of course, alcohol helped with all of this. Mead made storytelling funnier, crafting sloppier, and family arguments slightly more entertaining for everyone watching. The Vikings didn't just fight the cold with cloaks, fires, and a questionable relationship with farm animals. They fought it with their mindset, and not the inspirational poster kind. More like a grim, deep-seated refusal to be impressed by nature, trying to kill them. For the average Norse person, winter wasn't unexpected or tragic. It was simply part of the calendar, like planting season or the time to raid France again. They didn't fear winter. They prepared for it, expected it, and met it with the emotional equivalent of a shrug. That wasn't an accident. Viking culture trained people from birth to see hardship not as a problem, but as a test. Cold, pain, hunger, that wasn't failure, that was character building. You didn't complain. You endured, hopefully with a serious face, and maybe a sarcastic comment about how this was still better than dealing with taxes. This mindset wasn't just cultural, it was spiritual. Norse mythology is filled with frost giants, endless winters, and gods who push through suffering like it's a casual Tuesday. When your belief system includes a literal apocalypse called Fimbulwinter, and endless, all-consuming freeze before the world ends, you stop flinching at a little snow. This mental toughness was strengthened by society. Weakness wasn't exactly mocked, it was simply ignored. No one wanted to be the one who couldn't handle the dark. So, people kept going. They stayed busy. They joked about the cold. They laughed in the face of despair, then poured another mug of mead and kept sewing their 43rd mitten. Even children were taught to be tough early on. If your fingers were cold, you used your elbows. If your toes were numb, you walked faster. If you fell through ice and survived, congratulations, you were now interesting enough to tell stories about. Was it healthy? Probably not. Was it effective? Absolutely. Modern survival guides talk about the importance of mindset. The Vikings already knew. They didn't see winter as an enemy to be beaten. They saw it as a test, one they had already passed 100 times before. And that's how they survived the coldest nights, with fire, fur, and a psychological middle finger raised to the wind. If there's one thing the Vikings understood better than most, it was this: no one survives winter alone. You can have the warmest cloak, the fattest goat, and the strongest longhouse, but without a community, you're just a cold person with great stuff. Viking society was built on relying on each other. Families didn't live alone. They gathered in farms, villages, or settlements, often made up of extended family and close friends. When winter hit, this network became your actual lifeline. Food was shared. Firewood was gathered together. If your roof collapsed, someone helped you fix it. If your child got sick, someone offered herbs, prayers, or, at the very least, a sympathetic grunt. This wasn't just being nice for the sake of it. It was survival math. The more people you kept alive through winter, the more hands you had in the spring for farming, sailing, fighting, or just holding back the cows during planting season. Helping others helped you, even if that meant sharing your last smoked fish with a cousin you didn't particularly like. During midwinter feasts like Yule, this bond was made stronger with food, storytelling, and some light drunken philosophy. These weren't just parties, they were social glue, keeping spirits up and reminding everyone they weren't facing the darkness alone. Even how they stored resources showed this mindset. Shared granaries, meat cellars, and smokehouses were not uncommon. If one family's supplies ran out, others helped out. Not because it was polite, but because winter was long, and one weak link in the chain could bring down the whole group. Justice and leadership played a role. Local chieftains or legal leaders were responsible for keeping order, but also for making sure no one froze in a ditch. Their reputation depended on their ability to manage both laws and resources. A respected leader was one who could settle a fight and organize firewood collection. There was also, of course, peer pressure. If you tried to hoard food or skip your chores, your neighbors would notice. And in Viking society, being judged by the entire village was just slightly worse than death. At the end of it all, the snow, the darkness, the farm animals snoring in your bed, one truth remained. The Vikings didn't just survive winter, they turned it into a test. Every layer of wool, every puff of smoke, every grim joke around the fire was part of a cultural plan, designed for one purpose: to endure. Winter wasn't a roadblock, it was an opponent. And the Vikings, they trained all year for the match. They were always adapting. If the longhouse was too drafty, they patched it with moss. If the stew was thin, they made it thicker with a turnip. If the nights dragged on for weeks, they filled them with stories, games, rituals, and the occasional unplanned wrestling match between cousins. No central heating. Fine, they built fire pits. No waterproof gear. They invented it out of sheep and stubbornness. No antidepressants. They had sagas, mead, and the kind of dark humor that makes seasonal sadness afraid to show up. And while other civilizations slowed down in winter, the Vikings used it to get stronger. Weapons were repaired, children were trained, and new ideas were formed around the fire. When the ice melted, these people didn't stumble, blinking into the sun. They came out ready to plant crops, build ships, make alliances, or sail across oceans to places that were warmer, richer, or simply worth raiding. Winter didn't weaken them, it hardened them, made them leaner, meaner, and more creative. Their success didn't come from magic or divine help. It came from a determined, often smoky, commitment to survival by any means necessary. Whether that meant sleeping under a goat, steaming in a hut, or eating yogurt that could also be used as industrial sealant, they did it. And they did it together. Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809, in a one-room log cabin on the edge of the Kentucky wilderness. It was a place where survival was never certain and education was an afterthought. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a hard-working but uneducated farmer and carpenter. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, was quiet, gentle, and able to read, which was rare on the frontier. Together, they lived in near poverty, trying to make a life from poor soil and thick woods. The cabin itself had no windows, no floor, and definitely no bookshelves. For much of his early life, Abraham's world was one of candlelight, silence, and endless work. He would grow up chopping wood, carrying water, and wearing clothes that were more patch than fabric. There was no formal schooling. In those early years, in fact, Lincoln would later guess that he had less than a single year of proper education in his entire life. But he had something more powerful, a curious mind and a deep hunger to learn. When Nancy Hanks died in 1818, possibly from a sickness from milk, Abraham was only 9 years old. Her death left a hole in the boy's life that would never truly be filled. She had been his emotional support, the one who saw something different in him. After her burial, which was done by hand in the forest behind their farm, young Abe carved a wooden marker himself. It was rough, simple, and soaked with tears, but it said everything. He remembered her. A few months later, Thomas remarried a widow named Sarah Bush Johnston. Unlike the typical evil stepmother, Sarah brought warmth, books, and order. She saw Lincoln's intelligence and encouraged his curiosity. Between chores, he read everything he could find: Aesop's, fables, Robinson Crusoe, the Bible. If he couldn't get a book, he'd write his own thoughts with charcoal on wooden boards. This boy, barefoot and skinny, with a face too serious for his age, was already building something inside himself. The world hadn't given him much. No money, no connections, no comfort. But he had a fire inside that couldn't be put out. And in that tiny cabin in the Kentucky woods, Abraham Lincoln began the long, unlikely climb toward greatness. As Lincoln grew into his teenage years, life on the frontier didn't get any easier. If anything, it got harder. His family moved again, this time to the thick, swampy forests of Indiana. Every day was a battle against nature, clearing trees, plowing heavy clay soil, and surviving harsh winters with little more than a fireplace and hope. But while his body was shaped by the axe and the land, his mind remained somewhere else entirely. He became known among his neighbors, not for his strength, though he was very strong, but for his great height and his strange habit of reading during every free moment. He'd carry books while walking, recite Shakespeare from memory while fixing fences, and sit under trees, writing thoughts in the margins of whatever scrap paper he could find. His humor began to develop, too. It was dry, observant, and often made fun of himself. He was the odd one, the tall teenager who quoted Jefferson while others told hunting stories. Lincoln had an awkward way with people. He was shy but talkative, strange yet charming. When he did speak, people listened. They couldn't help it. His words were clear, powerful, sometimes funny, but always aimed at something true. His moral compass, even then, pointed straight north. He hated cruelty, he hated slavery, and he hated the way ignorance was used to justify both. Despite his lack of formal education, Lincoln began to develop a passion for law. The idea that words, not fists, could win battles interested him. He taught himself how to write clearly and argue logically. He read every law book he could find. At night, others might be drinking or gambling. Lincoln would be in a dim room reading legal books by candlelight. By his early 20s, he left home for good. He worked on a flatboat on the Mississippi River, seeing firsthand the horrors of the slave trade in New Orleans. Those images would stay with him, burned into his conscience. When he returned, he moved to New Salem, Illinois, and began to remake himself. He taught himself grammar, joined the local debate club, and through pure willpower began the long journey toward becoming a lawyer. He had no diploma, no degree, no family connections, just a belief that knowledge was power and that it could be carved out, like everything else in his life, with effort, vision, and a little bit of pain. By the time Abraham Lincoln became a lawyer, he was already a legend in central Illinois, not because he was famous, but because of his presence. He wasn't the kind of man who walked into a room and demanded attention with expensive clothes or smooth charm. He was often messy, his pants too short, his coat ill-fitting. But when he stood to speak, people leaned in. He had something more valuable than fashion: clarity, honesty, and the ability to connect with people. Lincoln's legal career was unusual. He didn't go to law school. He read law books borrowed from kind attorneys and passed the bar exam by studying on his own. Once he was a lawyer. He traveled the 8th Judicial Circuit, a huge network of rural courts that he visited on horseback, sometimes for weeks at a time. The roads were mud in the spring, dust in the summer, and ice in the winter. He slept in taverns, log cabins, and under the stars, but he loved it. What made Lincoln special in court wasn't just his logic, it was his empathy. He could connect with jury members in a way that polished lawyers never could. He'd speak simply, tell vivid stories, and treat even the smallest farmer or poorest widow with respect. One farmer said, "He makes you feel like he's one of us, not above us." And that was the truth. Lincoln never forgot where he came from, and he never pretended to be anything he wasn't. But he wasn't soft in court when a case mattered. When he believed in it, he was determined. His speeches could be slow, even awkward, but they built up power. He'd lay out facts like bricks, one after another, until the other side's argument fell apart. His questioning of witnesses was like a gentle trap. He'd make them feel comfortable, then ask a question that destroyed their story. Over time, Lincoln became known as Honest Abe. It wasn't a campaign slogan. It was earned. He returned fees if he thought a case was unfair. He refused to represent clients who lied, and when other lawyers cut corners, he simply walked away. His reputation grew as a lawyer who understood the law and the land. But behind the scenes, another fire was growing. Politics. The law had taught him how people worked. Now he wanted to help change the system they lived in. And as slavery became a bigger national issue, Lincoln's quiet conscience was about to roar. Lincoln's first real step into politics wasn't exactly a huge success. In 1832, at just 23 years old, he ran for the Illinois state legislature and lost. But failure didn't stop him. If anything, it showed him what he needed to do: listen more, learn more, and meet people where they were. 2 years later, he tried again and won. In Springfield, the new capital, Lincoln quickly became known for his thoughtful speeches, dry humor, and moral beliefs. He didn't shout, he didn't scheme, but when he stood up in the State House and spoke, people remembered it. He wasn't interested in cheap wins or flashy slogans. His goal was deeper: to understand the workings of law, society, and justice. Lincoln joined the Whig Party, a group that believed in modernization, building infrastructure, and limiting the power of the president. But even as a Whig, he remained careful about his ambition. He often joked about being too ugly for politics. He read constantly, debated with energy, but never seemed to want power the way other men did. If anything, politics seemed to be a responsibility he accepted rather than chased. During his 4 terms in the Illinois legislature, Lincoln built relationships with farmers, merchants, and other lawyers. He wasn't the loudest person in the room, but he was often the most trusted. He developed a reputation for being principled, especially about slavery. Though he wasn't calling for an end to slavery yet, he firmly opposed its spread into new territories. He called it unjust, immoral, and a national shame. In 1846, Lincoln made the jump to national politics, winning a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. There, he took a bold and unpopular stand against the Mexican-American War, calling it unconstitutional and unnecessary. This was not a winning move politically. His district didn't like it. He served a single term and didn't run again. Back in Springfield, he returned to his law practice, married Mary Todd, a well-educated woman from a slave-owning Kentucky family, and tried to live a quieter life. But the nation was changing quickly. The Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and the expansion of slavery were tearing the country apart. Lincoln might have left politics, but politics hadn't left him. The debates were growing louder and bloodier. The Union was beginning to crack, and the man, once known for his caution, was about to rise. Not as a candidate, but as a conscience. By the 1850s, the issue of slavery was no longer just simmering, it was boiling. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which allowed new territories to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery, led to fierce violence and deeper divisions. Bleeding Kansas became a national symbol of chaos. For Abraham Lincoln, it was a turning point. He couldn't stay silent any longer. He returned to the political stage, not with loud talk, but with a sense of moral urgency. He joined the newly formed Republican Party, a group of former Whigs, Free Soilers, and abolitionists, all united. Lincoln was not a radical abolitionist. He didn't call for immediate freedom for all slaves yet, but he believed deeply that slavery was wrong, and that allowing it to spread into new states was both dangerous and unfair. In 1858, he was pushed into the national spotlight during his Senate campaign against Stephen A. Douglas, one of the most famous politicians in America. The two agreed to a series of debates across Illinois, and what followed became one of the most famous political showdowns in American history. The Lincoln-Douglas debates. Douglas defended the idea that each state should choose whether to allow slavery. Lincoln countered with clarity. "A house divided against itself cannot stand," he declared. If slavery continued to spread, it would tear the Union apart. He argued that the nation couldn't survive permanently, half slave and half free. He didn't win that Senate race, but he won something greater: national attention. Newspapers reprinted his words across the country. People who had never heard Lincoln before now whispered about the tall lawyer from Illinois with the deep-set eyes and even deeper beliefs. Though he lost, he had proven himself. He stood face to face with one of the great speakers of the time and never backed down. He challenged the nation's comfort, not for personal gain, but because his conscience demanded it. Privately, Lincoln struggled with the huge scale of the issue. He once wrote that if slavery isn't wrong, then nothing is wrong. But he also knew that acting too quickly could shatter the fragile Union. Still, the decision was made. National mood was shifting, and Lincoln was rising with it. Not as a politician with easy answers, but as a voice of moral clarity in a time of moral confusion. By 1860, America stood on the edge of a knife. Tensions between the North and South had reached a breaking point. Slavery wasn't just a moral debate anymore. It was a political firestorm. Southern states threatened to leave the Union, and the Republican Party was scrambling to find a leader. Who could unite the North without starting an immediate war? That unlikely person turned out to be Abraham Lincoln. At the Republican National Convention in Chicago, he was not the favorite. In fact, most expected the nomination to go to Senator William Seward of New York, a polished politician with decades of experience. But Lincoln had something the others didn't: a clean reputation, a moderate tone, and strong momentum from his debates with Douglas. His team campaigned hard behind the scenes, highlighting his frontier roots and personal honesty. Lincoln was shown as the self-made man, the rail splitter, who rose from nothing. His humble beginnings weren't a weakness. They were a symbol of American potential. By the third vote, he won the nomination. and the political world blinked in surprise. The general election was bitter and divided. The Democratic Party split in two, with northern and southern groups backing different candidates. Lincoln's name didn't even appear on most southern ballots, but in the north and west, he had huge support. On November 6, 1860, he was elected, the 16th President of the United States, with just 40% of the popular vote. But a clear majority in the Electoral College. He didn't celebrate. In fact, the mood was serious. Within weeks, South Carolina voted to leave the Union. 6 more southern states followed before Lincoln even took office. The country was falling apart faster than anyone expected as he prepared to travel from Springfield to Washington, D.C. for his inauguration. Lincoln received death threats daily. Some warned he wouldn't survive the journey. Security was so tight that he had to sneak into the Capitol by train at night, disguised and unannounced. This was not the triumphant arrival of a winner. It was the reluctant entrance of a president-elect whose election had broken the Union. When Lincoln finally took the oath of office on March 4, 1861, he faced a country that was divided, angry, and armed. And yet, in his speech, he called not for revenge, but for peace. "We are not enemies, but friends," he said. "We must not be enemies." But the winds of war were already howling at the door. Barely a month after Abraham Lincoln took office, the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The Civil War had begun. What followed was the bloodiest conflict in American history, a brutal test not just of military strength, but of Lincoln's character, leadership, and determination. Lincoln had no military background. He had briefly served as a captain in the Black Hawk War, but had never seen a battle. Now he was the commander-in-chief of a nation at war with itself. He spent long nights in the War Department reading telegrams, studying maps, and learning strategy as he went. He read books on warfare, questioned his generals, and obsessed over troop movements. He wasn't a warrior by nature, but he became one out of necessity. His early presidency was filled with frustration. General after general disappointed him. George McClellan, in particular, had the loyalty of the troops, but the caution of a man afraid to fight. Lincoln, frustrated by delays and excuses, once asked, "If General McClellan does not want to use the army, I would like to borrow it for a while." But Lincoln's real genius wasn't just in battlefield decisions, it was in his vision. He understood that this war wasn't just about states' rights or leaving the Union, it was about the very soul of the nation. Could a country built on liberty survive half enslaved? At first, Lincoln moved carefully on slavery, fearing that aggressive action would push border states to join the Confederacy. But as the war dragged on and the number of deaths grew, his thinking changed. The moral issue and the military one became linked. Slavery, he concluded, was the engine of the Confederate economy and spirit. If it wasn't destroyed, the rebellion would never die. On January 1, 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring all slaves in Confederate-held territories to be free. It didn't free everyone overnight, but it changed everything. The war was no longer just a fight to save the Union. It was a fight for human freedom. Internationally, it closed the door on British or French support for the Confederacy. Domestically, it gave black men the moral and legal reason to join the Union Army, which thousands did, fighting for a country that had long denied them citizenship. Lincoln had transformed from the log cabin lawyer into a wartime president, holding not only authority but also moral power. As the war dragged into its 4th year, Lincoln carried its burden alone at the top. He was thinner, grayer, and visibly older. Every day brought new lists of dead soldiers. Towns became graveyards. He received letters from grieving mothers and wives, each demanding to know why their sons and husbands had died. And though he never fought on a battlefield, Lincoln carried the war in his eyes and on his shoulders. His cabinet was a mix of political rivals, men who once ran against him and didn't always respect him. But Lincoln managed them like a conductor, balancing ambition with purpose. He didn't rule by fear or force. He ruled with patience, stories, and clarity. Even his critics began to admit that the man had steel beneath his smile. And then came Gettysburg. The battle in July 1863 was a turning point. Over 50,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing in 3 days of horror. Months later, Lincoln traveled to Pennsylvania to deliver a short speech at the new cemetery. It wasn't meant to be a major headline, just a few words of reflection. But in just 272 words, he rewrote the purpose of the war, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The Gettysburg Address wasn't grand. It was simple, respectful, and timeless. And it made clear that this war wasn't just about unity. It was about redemption, about remaking the nation into what it had always claimed to be. As the 1864 presidential election approached, Lincoln faced deep opposition. The war was still raging, and his support was falling. Even within his own party, there were calls to replace him on the ticket. Many believed he'd lose to Democrat George McClellan, the very general he had fired. But as Union victories increased late that year, especially General Sherman's capture of Atlanta, the momentum swung back in Lincoln's favor. He was re-elected with a clear majority. Still, Lincoln didn't gloat. "It is not in my nature to triumph over anyone," he said. The war was nearly won, but Lincoln knew peace would be harder. The Union could be rebuilt with guns, but the nation's soul, that would take something much deeper: mercy, vision, and healing. By early 1865, the Confederacy was collapsing. Cities fell one after another. Richmond, the Confederate capital, was burning. General Robert E. Lee's army was running out of supplies, soldiers, and time, and yet Lincoln showed no joy. For him, victory was never about punishment. It was about restoration. In his second inaugural address, delivered on March 4th, 1865, Lincoln spoke not as a winner, but as a moral philosopher. "With malice toward none, with charity for all," he said, "with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in." These were not the words of a politician looking to crush his enemies. They were the words of a father trying to save his broken family. On April 9th, Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The war was over. The Union had been saved. Slavery, through the approval of the 13th Amendment, had been ended. For the first time in centuries, the nation took a shaky step toward the ideals it had declared in 1776. But just as the country breathed a sigh of relief, tragedy struck. Only 5 days after the surrender, Abraham Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington. In the middle of the performance, actor and Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth snuck into the presidential box and shot Lincoln in the back of the head. He died the next morning, April 15th, 1865. The nation mourned like never before. Black Americans, many newly freed, wept in the streets. Former enemies, even in the South, recognized the depth of the loss. He had been their best hope for reconciliation, a man who never saw politics as war and never let hatred grow in his heart. Lincoln didn't live to see Reconstruction or to heal the wounds his presidency had helped expose. But his death transformed him from a leader into a symbol of freedom, unity, and the painful price of moral progress. From the dirt floor of a Kentucky cabin to the highest office in the land, Abraham Lincoln rose without money, without privilege, and without cruelty. He led a nation through its darkest hour, not with blinding brilliance, but with a steady, stubborn light. And that light, dimmed by an assassin's bullet, still burns in the story of America. When we imagine the ancient world, we usually think of mighty empires, glittering temples, and epic battles. What we rarely think about is how these people pooped, yet sanitation, or the lack of it, shaped daily life as much as any king or war. Behind every marble palace or clay brick home, someone had to deal with the mess. And in a time without flush buttons or scented sprays, that was a much more public and smelly business than we like to admit. Toilets in the ancient world weren't just about comfort, they were about survival. Human waste carries disease, and when it's poorly managed, as it often was, entire communities suffered. Dysentery, cholera, and parasite infections were common, invisible killers. In cities without sanitation, waste flowed through the streets, soaked into wells, and clung to sandals. But in places that took sanitation seriously, something amazing happened. People lived longer, plagues became less common, and cities grew. Surprisingly, some of the world's oldest civilizations developed systems that wouldn't look entirely out of place today. The Indus Valley cities had drainage systems for the whole street and brick toilets. The Minoans built ceramic pipes and flushing systems. The Romans, they practically turned waste management into an art form. And while other societies, like the Vikings or early Chinese dynasties, handled things a bit more simply, even they had methods that showed their cultural ideas about health, modesty, and the natural world. But let's be clear, ancient toilets were not always private, not always clean, and certainly not dignified. Shared latrines were often the norm, especially in military camps or cities. Picture 20 stone holes in a row, with no dividers. Everyone seated elbow to elbow, gossiping or arguing while doing their business. Sponges on sticks were passed around. Water was used to rinse, not always to flush. And beneath it all, quite literally, were the earliest forms of sewers, cesspits, and sometimes just open ditches. Sanitation was a mirror of a society's values. Where it was ignored, chaos followed. Where it was engineered, civilization grew. And if you're brave enough to look past the filth, you'll discover a hidden history. One where pipes, pits, and poop tell us more about ancient life than monuments ever could. Long before the Romans built aqueducts, or the Greeks dreamed of public baths, the people of the Indus Valley were already solving one of civilization's dirtiest problems, sanitation. Dating back to around 2600 BCE, the cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, located in what is now modern-day Pakistan, were surprisingly advanced in their city planning, especially when it came to managing human waste. At first glance, the remains of these ancient cities might seem like nothing more than dusty ruins. But look closer, and you'll find a highly organized network of brick-lined streets with standard measurements and, most impressively, covered drainage systems running alongside them. Yes, while much of the world was still digging holes in the ground, the Indus people had figured out how to keep their cities flowing and their homes clean. Each house, even simple ones, had a small room for washing, often with a squat-style toilet or bathing area connected to a vertical chute. This chute sent waste into a covered brick drain outside, which then joined larger public sewers. These were not simple ditches. They were engineered with inspection holes, slopes, and even brick walls to catch solids. Some scholars suggest that Waste from richer homes was flushed using jars of water, with gravity doing the rest. And the genius didn't stop at toilets. The Indus system also separated stormwater from waste. Public wells were scattered around the streets. And while we can't say for sure how water safety was handled, the very presence of sanitation systems suggests a high value on public health, which was rare for its time. But perhaps most stunning of all is the lack of palaces or temples in these cities. The Indus people were apparently more concerned with equality and city function than with divine monuments. And their toilet systems show that. They were practical, widespread, and surprisingly democratic. Sadly, much about the Indus civilization remains a mystery. Their writing system is still not understood, and we don't know exactly why their cities eventually declined. But their toilets, the silent brick channels buried beneath their feet, still speak volumes. In an age when many empires ruled through spectacle, the Indus chose something quieter, cleaner, and arguably more civilized. While the Indus Valley engineered underground sewers, the ancient Egyptians approached sanitation with a different view, one based on ritual, status, and a deep belief in physical and spiritual purity. For them, cleanliness wasn't just about avoiding disease. It was a form of worship. In the Nile-fed civilization of ancient Egypt, bathing was an essential daily routine, especially for the wealthy. The homes of the elite often had small limestone basins or bathing rooms where servants would pour water for washing. Oils, natron, a natural salt, and perfumed ointments were commonly used, and hair removal was routine. But when it came to toilets, things got a little more practical. Toilets in ancient Egypt ranged from simple pits lined with sand to more refined limestone or wooden seats placed above ceramic pots. These pots were emptied by servants or slaves and dumped far from living areas, ideally into the desert. In richer homes, these seats might be hidden away in private rooms, hinting at the growing link between sanitation and status. Public sanitation, however, was almost non-existent. Streets in cities like Thebes or Memphis were often dirty, and while waste was sometimes used as fertilizer in rural areas, it wasn't always managed responsibly in cities. Instead, the focus remained on personal cleanliness. Priests, for example, were required to bathe multiple times a day, shave their bodies, and avoid impurities. They couldn't enter temples without ritual washing, which sometimes included enemas, not for health reasons, but as spiritual preparation. Interestingly, the tombs of pharaohs and nobles occasionally included toilet stools among their grave goods. It seems the ancient Egyptians expected that even in the afterlife, one would still need to do their business, and do it with dignity. The Egyptians also made early attempts at pest control. Amulets, spells, and ointments were used to ward off flies and other carriers of disease. In this way, cleanliness mixed the physical and the mystical. In short, while Egypt didn't develop large-scale sewer systems, it pioneered a cultural focus on hygiene. Their obsession with purity influenced medicine, religion, and daily life. And though their toilets may have been simple, their ideas about cleanliness were anything but. While most of Bronze Age Europe was squatting over pits, the Minoans of Crete were flushing. Yes, flushing. Over 3,500 years ago, the Minoan civilization, which thrived from roughly 2,700 to 1450 BCE, developed one of the most advanced plumbing systems in the ancient world. Their capital at Naissus wasn't just home to maze-like myths and paintings. It also had multi-story buildings with running water and working toilets. The Minoans understood something that many civilizations wouldn't figure out for centuries: gravity and water pressure. Their palaces had terracotta pipes laid beneath the floors and inside walls, carrying rainwater and spring water into fountains, baths, and, perhaps most notably, toilets. In the Queen's Chamber at Nassau, archaeologists discovered what may be the oldest known flush toilet, a wooden seat set over a stone basin connected to a vertical pipe which could be flushed with water poured by hand from a container. Bathing was also a high priority. The Minoans built large ceramic bathtubs, not unlike those found in modern homes. Water could be supplied from rooftop tanks or aqueducts and drained through underground channels. The use of U-shaped water traps to block odor, a forerunner to the modern plumbing trap, has even been suggested, though this is still debated. What's particularly striking is how these systems were built into elite homes, suggesting that comfort and cleanliness were signs of status. Unlike later Roman toilets, which were public and shared, Minoan sanitation was more private. Your toilet was in your own home, a luxury that even many 19th century Europeans didn't have. The Minoans weren't just practical, they were stylish about it. Their bathrooms were decorated with colorful paintings and elegant plasterwork. Sanitation, it seems, could be both functional and fashionable. Unfortunately, the fall of the Minoan civilization around 1450 BCE, possibly due to volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, or invasions, led to the loss of these innovations. It would take over 1,000 years for similar toilet technology to appear again in other parts of the Mediterranean. Still, the ruins of Nassau whisper a simple truth: the desire to stay clean, flush away waste, and bathe in privacy isn't a modern obsession. It's ancient, deeply human, and in the case of the Minoans, impressively advanced. When it comes to ancient sanitation, no civilization made a bigger, bolder statement than the Romans. By the peak of the Roman Empire, they had mastered the art of infrastructure, aqueducts, roads, and yes, toilets. For the Romans, sanitation wasn't just about cleanliness, it was about civilization itself. And that meant making toilets public, efficient, and, surprisingly, social. Walk into any major Roman city, from Pompeii to Londinium, and you'd likely find public latrines, open rooms with long stone benches, each carved with evenly spaced holes. No stalls, no dividers, just elbow-to-elbow seating. Ran a steady stream of water to carry away waste, and a second channel held sponge sticks, the Roman answer to toilet paper. These sponges were rinsed communally in water and vinegar, then reused. Hygienic, not quite functional. While taking care of nature's call, latrines were often decorated with mosaics or inscriptions, some of them funny or even crude. Graffiti inside Pompeii's latrines includes complaints about bad smells, poor plumbing, and, of course, rude users. But Roman sanitation went far beyond toilets. Their cities were crossed with enormous sewer systems, the most famous being the Cloaca Maxima in Rome. Built initially to drain marshes, it became the backbone of Rome's waste management system. Rainwater, urine, and feces all flowed through it, fed by aqueducts that brought in fresh water from miles away. In private homes, wealthier Romans had indoor toilets that emptied into cesspits or directly into the sewers. The poor relied on chamber pots, which were sometimes dumped from windows into the street, despite laws against it. Apartment dwellers, especially in multi-story tenements, suffered the worst. Many buildings had no plumbing at all, and the lower floors often flooded with sewage. Interestingly, Romans taxed urine. Emperor Vespasian even started a pee tax on public urinals, a move so famous that his name is still associated with urinals in France and Italy today. In short, Roman toilets weren't just advanced, they were loud, crowded, political, and strangely progressive. The ancient Greeks took a more modest approach. To them, bodily functions were personal, something to be handled quietly, discreetly, and preferably alone. That said, they still made significant contributions to sanitation and cleanliness, just in a very different way. In most Greek homes, the toilet was simple, a clay pot or stone seat over a cesspit. There were no flushing systems and no sewer connections in ordinary homes. The waste was usually collected and emptied by hand, often by slaves, into pits or dumped in remote areas. City streets sometimes had open drains, but as cities grew, so did the smell. Sanitation was a problem, but not always a priority. Yet, the Greeks were obsessed with bathing. Gymnasia, where men exercised naked, were almost always connected to large public bathhouses. These weren't just for scrubbing off sweat. They were central social places to network, debate philosophy, and prepare for civic life. Unlike Roman baths, which were fancy and filled with marble, Greek baths were simpler, often with circular tubs, cold water basins, or shallow pools. Water management was key to this culture of bathing. The Greeks built aqueducts, cisterns, and terracotta pipe systems to supply fresh water to cities like Athens. In fact, the Athenian agora had one of the earliest known examples of a public latrine, complete with stone seats and a drainage system. But these were rare. The public toilet was never truly normalized in Greek society as it was in Rome. What the Greeks lacked in plumbing, they made up for in theory. Hippocrates, the so-called father of medicine, was among the first to link sanitation to health. He suggested that dirty water and filth could spread disease, a radical idea at the time. His recommendations for clean air, fresh water, and dry housing would later influence Roman city planning. The irony is clear. The civilization that gave us democracy and drama still preferred to handle its dirtiest business in private. Sanitation for the Greeks was not about infrastructure. It was about individual discipline and philosophical hygiene. Clean body, clean mind. And while their toilets may have been simple, their obsession with purity, both physical and moral, helped lay the foundation for modern public health thinking. In ancient China, cleanliness was both a personal duty and a reflection of cosmic balance. Sanitation, while not as infrastructure-heavy as in Rome or the Indus Valley, was still deeply woven into daily life through customs, philosophies, and a surprisingly wide range of toilet tools. Most ancient Chinese homes did not have toilets in the modern sense. Instead, chamber pots were the norm. These portable ceramic or bronze containers came in all shapes and sizes, from simple to fancy, depending on one's status. After use, servants or family members would empty the pots into larger household cesspits or take them outside the city walls. Some rural families used human waste, known as night soil, as fertilizer, a practice that continued for centuries. Public toilets did exist, especially in larger cities like Chang'an or Lu. These shared facilities were often basic pits or troughs with wooden platforms to sit or squat on. Interestingly, some of these toilets had privacy screens, a courtesy not often found in ancient Rome. Waste from these locations was usually collected and reused in agriculture, which, while efficient, also carried risks of contamination and disease. Toilet paper, or something very close to it, may have started in China. As early as the 2nd century BCE, people were using soft papers, often discarded writings, for hygiene. By the 6th century CE, scholars recorded the use of paper, specifically for cleaning after defecation. The elite preferred silk scraps or bamboo spatulas that were washed between uses. Yes, you read that correctly. polished bamboo sticks were among the earliest reusable wiping tools. Sanitation wasn't just physical, it was spiritual, influenced by Confucian ideals of order and respect, and Taoist beliefs in harmony and purity. Hygiene was linked to self-discipline and balance. Excrement, though natural, was seen as a pollutant, something to be quickly removed and never discussed in polite company. Imperial households took this to the extreme, with specially appointed eunuchs managing waste disposal in complete secrecy. Despite the lack of underground sewers, ancient China maintained fairly clean cities thanks to careful human labor, cultural taboos, and a well-organized system of waste collection. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Through chamber pots, composting, and paper wipes, the Chinese found their own path to sanitation, one that was humble, efficient, and deeply rooted in tradition. When it comes to ancient sanitation, might not be the first group that comes to mind, known more for their raids than their routines. Norse hygiene was actually more sophisticated and surprisingly disciplined than stereotypes suggest. Beneath the horned helmet myths lies a culture that, while rough around the edges, took personal cleanliness and waste management more seriously than much of medieval Europe. In Viking settlements, especially in places like Jorvik modern-day York, England, and Hiddeby in modern Germany, archaeologists have uncovered latrine pits lined with timber or stone. These were basic, functional toilets used by both individuals and households. These pits were often dug a short distance from homes, and were sometimes covered by wooden structures to provide privacy and shelter from the harsh northern climate. The waste from these latrines, a combination of human excrement, food scraps, and animal remains, tells us more than just what Vikings ate. It shows that they had a method of centralized waste disposal. In some cases, these pits were periodically cleaned out and reused. In others, new pits were simply dug when the old ones filled. Some evidence even suggests early composting practices, as waste would naturally decompose and return to the soil. Over time, inside homes, chamber pots and buckets were common, especially during long, frozen winters, when stepping outside wasn't exactly ideal. These were usually emptied into latrine pits or dung heaps near the edges of a settlement. While not glamorous, it was practical and far more sanitary than throwing waste into the street, a practice common in some medieval cities. But hygiene wasn't just functional, it was cultural. Vikings bathed regularly, often once a week, usually on Lagardæger or washing day, the origin of the English word Saturday. Combs, ear cleaners, and tweezers made from bone or antler are common finds in Norse archaeological sites. Personal grooming mattered not just for appearance, but for social status and marriage prospects. While Viking sanitation lacked the engineering feats of Rome or the ritual purity of Egypt, it was rooted in pragmatism. They didn't build sewers or invent toilet paper, but they managed their waste, kept clean, and adapted to a harsh environment with earthy, no-nonsense solutions. In the land of ice and iron, even the business of doing your business was handled with the blunt efficiency of a people who didn't have time for fuss. Across civilizations and centuries, one truth remains constant: no society could thrive without figuring out what to do with its waste. From the hidden sewers of the Indus Valley to the shared latrines of Rome and the chamber pots of ancient China, humanity's relationship with sanitation has always walked a fine line between necessity and neglect. What's striking is how different cultures prioritized hygiene. Some, like the Romans and Minoans, invested heavily in infrastructure. They built aqueducts, flush systems, and sewage networks that, in some cases, were as functional as those in 19th-century cities. Others, like the Greeks and Chinese, placed cleanliness in the realm of personal virtue, linking it to health, ethics, and harmony with nature. Still others, like the Vikings, took a ruggedly practical approach. Dig a pit, wash when you can, and don't let filth fester near your food. Despite their differences, these societies were all working toward the same goal: separating people from their waste. The reasons varied: to prevent disease, to honor the gods. But the outcome shaped how cities grew, how laws were made, and how people viewed their bodies. Ironically, much of this ancient wisdom was lost during the Middle Ages in Europe. After the fall of Rome, advanced sanitation systems crumbled, public toilets disappeared, sewers clogged, and disease surged. It would take centuries and multiple plagues for urban planners to revisit ideas the ancients had already mastered. And yet, traces of ancient sanitation still remain today. The word latrine comes from the Latin latrina. The modern flush toilet owes a distant debt to Minoan gravity systems. Even our use of paper in the bathroom was foreshadowed by the Chinese over 1,000 years ago. What feels modern is, in many cases, just rediscovered. Sanitation, often overlooked in historical stories, is a quiet backbone of civilization. It doesn't inspire poems or monuments, but without it, cities collapse, populations suffer, and even empires can fall. So the next time you walk into a restroom and enjoy the luxury of privacy, plumbing, and maybe even scented soap, remember, you're standing on the shoulders of generations who tried, failed, and sometimes succeeded in figuring out how to keep the filth away. And that, perhaps, is civilization's most underrated achievement. Before satellites, compasses, or even writing, humans had an instinct to map, not just to record where things were, but to make sense of their place in a vast and often terrifying world. A map wasn't just a picture of the land. It was a story, a belief system, a survival manual. It told people where the rivers flowed, where the sun rose, where the spirits lived, and where danger waited just beyond what was known. Some of the earliest maps weren't drawn on parchment or paper. They were carved into stone, scratched onto bone, or woven into spoken memory. Prehistoric carvings from over 14,000 years ago show animals, riverbanks, and groups of huts. Were they maps in the modern sense? Not quite. But they captured space in relation to movement and meaning. A fundamental start. As early societies grew and trade routes expanded, maps became essential tools of power. They guided merchants through mountains and deserts. They helped kings draw borders and tax their people. They even tried to explain the universe, mixing astronomy with religion. To map the stars was to touch the divine. To draw a city was to bring order to chaos. But mapping wasn't always about accuracy. In fact, ancient maps were often wildly distorted by today's standards. What mattered was meaning, not measurement. The center of the world was always home, whether that was Babylon, Jerusalem, or the island of Delos. Lands grew or shrank, depending on their importance. Unknown regions were filled with fantasy beasts, or labeled simply, "Here be dragons." Some cultures didn't even use flat maps at all. Polynesian navigators, for instance, created stick charts that recorded ocean currents and island waves, not for the eye, but for the hands and the mind. These weren't meant to be read like modern maps, but felt and memorized through ritual training. The instinct to map, to visualize space, time, and position is deeply human. Whether carved in clay, painted on walls, or sung in chants, maps helped ancient people connect with their environment, their gods, and each other. And while their methods varied wildly, their goal was always the same: to find their place in a mysterious and shifting world in the cradle of civilization. Among the temples and ziggurats of ancient Mesopotamia, the Babylonians began carving the first known maps into clay. These weren't just practical tools for land ownership or city planning. They were cosmic documents, attempts to bring order to a chaotic world by capturing it in wedge-shaped lines and symbols. One of the most famous examples is the Imago Mundi, a clay tablet from the 6th century BCE, now in the British Museum. It's often called the oldest known world map. At just 6 inches across, it's a tiny window into the Babylonian universe. At its center sits Babylon itself, shown as a rectangle surrounded by a circular landmass representing the known world. The Euphrates River cuts through the middle, and various cities, mountains, and regions are labeled. Beyond the world is a bitter river, likely the ocean, and then mysterious triangular islands, each with mythological descriptions. These weren't real places. They were symbolic zones of chaos and danger, the outer limits of what could be known. The Babylonians' mapping wasn't just geographic, it was spiritual. The heavens were mapped just as carefully as the earth. Babylonian astronomers tracked planetary movements, lunar cycles, and eclipses with amazing precision, all inscribed onto clay tablets with reed pens. These celestial records weren't only scientific, they were used to predict omens and tell the future. The map of the sky was a guide to fate. On a more local scale, land surveys were common and practical. Clay tablets from as early as 2300 BC show detailed plots of farmland with notes on boundaries, irrigation, canals, and ownership. These were the tools of officials, tax collectors, and priests. Precision mattered here not for navigation, but for managing wealth and resources. Babylonian maps reveal a people obsessed with structure, not just physical, but metaphysical. They mapped the world as they understood it, with themselves at the center, surrounded by rivers, enemies, gods, and mysteries. These maps weren't just records. They were expressions of belief, power, and a desire to make the unknowable a little more knowable. While the Babylonians mapped the world with mythic rings and cosmic rivers, the ancient Egyptians turned their attention to something far more grounded, the land itself. In the floodplains of the Nile, mapping wasn't abstract. It was about control, survival, and the sacred geometry of a kingdom that stretched from desert cliffs to delta marshes. The Egyptians didn't produce world maps in the Babylonian sense. Instead, their map-making was deeply practical. Every year, the Nile flooded, erasing boundary markers and farmland divisions. To restore order, surveyors used ropes, measuring rods, and sighting tools to redraw the grid. This wasn't a one-time ritual. It was an annual necessity. Mapping became a state function tightly controlled by temple scribes and royal officials. Surviving papyri show maps of remarkable precision. One of the oldest known is the Turin Papyrus map, dating to around 1160 BCE. It's not decorative or mythological. It's a mining map, a literal layout of valleys, hills, and gold-bearing regions. In the eastern desert, streams, roads, quarry sites, and notes in hieratic script mark distances and mineral types. This was a working map for officials and labor crews, not something hung on a palace wall. But Egyptian maps weren't entirely without symbolism. Temples were often built in alignment with celestial events, and cities were laid out with a sense of cosmic order. The map wasn't just a tool, it was a manifestation of Mat, the Egyptian concept of balance and harmony. Land division and urban planning followed sacred principles. Even pyramids and tombs were oriented with mathematical and astronomical precision. In religious texts, we also find conceptual maps of the underworld, such as those in the Book of the Dead. These spiritual maps showed the journey of the soul through 12 hours of night, guarded by serpents, gods, and gates. They weren't for navigation, but they were map-like in spirit, guiding the deceased through the terrain of eternity. Egyptian map-making, then, was a blend of bureaucracy and belief. Whether measuring a farmer's plot or charting the afterlife, maps were instruments of divine order. They weren't just about finding one's way on earth. They were about ensuring alignment with the gods. The Greeks didn't invent maps, but they revolutionized how maps were thought about. Geography transformed from a practical necessity into an intellectual pursuit, one that would lay the groundwork for modern map-making. One of the first conceptual maps of the world. Though the original has been lost, sources describe it as a circular disk with land masses like Europe and Asia spread around a central Mediterranean Sea. It was symbolic, yes, but it also marked a break from mythic views of the cosmos. Anaximander was trying to represent the physical world in a rational format. His map was accompanied by a geographical text called Periodos Gees. It contained detailed instructions for map-making, a list of over 8,000 place names with coordinates, and a grid-based system of latitude and longitude, long before GPS was even a dream. He also introduced projections to represent the curved Earth on a flat surface, an idea that still challenges modern mapmakers. Greek maps weren't just practical tools. The inhabited world was surrounded by oceans and barbarian lands. Greek thinkers also wrestled with the idea of a spherical Earth. He was remarkably accurate, off by only a few hundred miles, into science, and the world would never look the same again. If the Greeks gave us the theory of map-making, the Romans gave us its full military and logistical use. The Roman Empire wasn't just held together by laws and legions. It was stitched into one unit by a vast and meticulously maintained road network. And to keep it functioning, the Romans created some of the most practical and powerful maps of the ancient world. Unlike Greek maps, which aimed to describe the shape of the earth or explore the heavens, Roman maps were grounded in movement. They were tools of control, expansion, taxation, and supply. At the center of it all was the phrase, "All roads lead to Rome." It was a mapping philosophy. Perhaps the most famous Roman map is the Tabula Peutingeria, a 4th century CE copy of a much older Roman road map. It's not geographically accurate in the modern sense. Landmasses are stretched and distorted, but it serves its purpose perfectly, showing routes, stops, distances. Imagine a modern subway map where spatial accuracy is sacrificed for clarity of movement. That's Roman mapping in a nutshell. Way stations were marked at regular intervals, complete with distances in Roman miles. These maps allowed military commanders, merchants, and messengers to travel efficiently across thousands of kilometers. The empire became navigable not just in the field, but on parchment. In addition to road maps, the Romans also commissioned cadastral maps, highly detailed records of land ownership and boundaries used for taxation and legal disputes. Exactly who owned what. Control of land was control of power. And the Romans understood that with brutal clarity. Their focus was always on what could be conquered, traveled, or taxed. The map wasn't a cosmic vision. And yet, by making the empire readable, Roman maps created something enduring, a sense of shared space, of belonging to something bigger than your town or tribe. It was map-making as empire, functional, detailed, and ruthlessly efficient. while Roman maps emphasized roads and administration. Ancient Chinese mapmaking pursued a harmony between territory, governance, and the cosmos. In China, maps were never just geographical tools. Maps in China date back to the 4th century BCE, discovered in tombs like the one at Mawangdui. These silk maps show rivers, roads, and military positions, not drawn to scale, but incredibly detailed for their time. They were buried with the dead, perhaps to guide the spirit, or to demonstrate the deceased's command of territory. By the Han Dynasty 206 BCE to 220 CE, mapmaking had matured. Officials used maps to govern the empire's vast provinces, record tax zones, and plan military campaigns. Surveying tools and sighting instruments helped measure land with surprising accuracy. Some Han maps even included coordinate grids centuries before they appeared in the West. One of the most influential Chinese geographers was Pei Zhu. Active in the 3rd century CE, he established principles for scientific mapmaking, emphasizing scale, direction, and consistent measurement ideas that would become foundational to later Chinese and Korean mapping traditions. His work was so respected that he was called the father of Chinese cartography. But Chinese maps weren't only concerned with Earth. Cosmological charts were deeply important. The Chinese sky was mapped in constellations, grouped into celestial palaces and symbolic animals, the azure dragon of the east, the white tiger of the west, and so on. These star maps guided everything from agriculture to imperial rituals. The emperor, as the son of heaven, was believed to rule in alignment with celestial order. If his maps, and by extension his governance, fell out of harmony, so did his right to rule. In China, the map was not merely a tool of bureaucracy, it was a bridge between heaven and earth. Whether carved into stone, painted on silk, or etched into bronze, a map represented more than land. It reflected the emperor's ability to impose clarity on the chaos of the world. Far from the massive empires of Eurasia, the Polynesians developed one of the most unique and abstract forms of mapping in the world, one that didn't rely on paper, ink, or scale, but on deep experience and intuitive memory. Thousands of years before European explorers crossed the Atlantic, differently, not as static images, but as memory aids and hands-on guides for apprentice navigators. Stick charts were built from thin coconut fronds or wooden strips tied together with twine. The curves represented ocean waves, which behaved predictably in open water. Small shells or knots marked islands. The arrangement of the sticks captured how waves bent and interfered with each other, knowledge that allowed navigators to read the ocean surface like a roadmap. There were different types of charts. Rebel charts covered entire island groups, while Meadow focused on smaller regions or specific voyages. Then there were Matang, abstract teaching tools used to explain wave behavior near islands. These weren't meant to be carried on voyages. Instead, they were studied, memorized, and internalized. A skilled navigator could cross hundreds of miles using only their senses and what they'd learned from the stick chart. To the untrained eye, these maps look like broken ladders or art installations. But to a Polynesian wayfinder, they represent a deep ecological knowledge built not from conquest or geometry, but from a close and respectful relationship with nature. Polynesian mapmaking challenged the Western notion that a map must be visual and literal. Their maps were physical, experiential, and often invisible during travel. It wasn't about recording space, it was about feeling it. In many ways, these charts blur the line between science and spirituality. They were passed down through oral tradition, guarded by navigation schools, and held sacred. and in an ocean that could swallow even the boldest sailor. They helped the Polynesians find their way, not just across water, but through memory, rhythm, and ancestral knowledge. As the ancient world gave way to the medieval era, maps began to shift from scientific observation to symbolic interpretation. In many parts of the world, especially in Europe, map-making became more about representing spiritual truths and less about physical accuracy. The result was maps filled with monsters, paradise, demons, and a worldview where the center of geography was often the center of belief. One of the most iconic medieval map types is the two map, which dominated European thinking from the early Middle Ages to the Renaissance. These maps showed the world as a circle, the O divided by a T-shape into three parts: Asia on top, Europe to the lower left, and Africa to the lower right. Jerusalem often sat at the center, reinforcing the religious heart of the known world. East was usually at the top, not north, because that's where the Garden of Eden was believed to be. These maps weren't meant for navigation. They were theological tools, reinforcing a Christian worldview where the world's geography aligned with biblical history. Lands were labeled with the names of Noah's sons, and the unknown regions beyond the edges were populated by monstrous races. People with dog heads, feet like umbrellas, or faces in their chests. The further from Jerusalem, the stranger things got. But not all medieval maps were purely symbolic. Some, like the Tabula Rogeriana, created by Arab geographer Al-Idrisi in the 12th century, combined empirical observation with artistic flair. Commissioned by a Norman king in Sicily, this massive silver map was based on interviews with travelers, traders, and sailors from across the Muslim and Christian worlds. It was far more detailed and practical than its European counterparts, and it placed south at the top, a common feature in Islamic map-making. Meanwhile, Jewish, Indian, and Buddhist traditions also produced conceptual world maps, not focused on navigation, but on metaphysical structure. Mount Meru, for instance, featured as the cosmic axis in many Indian and Tibetan maps, surrounded by symbolic continents and divine realms. These medieval maps remind us that mapping isn't just about where things are, it's about what people believe the world means. In an age where the horizon still held terror and mystery, the map wasn't just a guide, it was a mirror of the soul. As the world grew larger in the minds of humans, so too did our desire to capture it, not only to get from point A to B, but to understand who we are, where we came from, and what surrounds us. Ancient maps, with all their flaws, distortions, and symbols, laid the foundation for the modern world's obsession with space, borders, and precision. What ties all ancient maps together is not accuracy, but intention. Babylonian tablets weren't meant to help you find a street. They showed the spiritual structure of the universe. Egyptian maps helped tax collectors and priests maintain divine order in a landscape governed by floods and gods. Greek maps introduced scale, geometry, and the bold idea that the world could be measured. Roman road maps stitched a vast empire together, helping legions, messengers, and merchants move like clockwork. Chinese maps fused astronomy with governance, always striving to reflect harmony between heaven and earth. Then there were the outliers, the Polynesian stick charts, tactile and abstract, showing that not all maps had to be seen. Some were meant to be felt and remembered. And the medieval religious maps, filled with beasts and paradise, which told viewers not just where the world was, but what it meant. Even the flaws in ancient maps are informative. They show us what mattered to a culture, what was centered, what was feared, and what was sacred. These maps remind us that geography is never neutral. It reflects priorities, power, myth, and memory. The Greeks put themselves in the middle. So did the Chinese. So did the Europeans. Everyone was the center of their own world. Today, with satellite imaging and digital precision, we can chart the planet down to the last meter. But the core impulse behind map-making remains the same as it was thousands of years ago. The human need to orient ourselves in something larger than ourselves. Whether it's a papyrus scroll, a clay tablet, or a glowing phone screen, every map answers the same ancient question: where am I?